Remote access is a necessary evil from a security standpoint, and there's a careful balance between security and convenience that has to be made when you're talking about implementing remote access and using remote access in your networks. Remote access provides administrators a way and end users a way to access their systems, their data from anywhere other than the office. Could be from home, could be from a hotel, whatever the case may be. It's all about enabling people to work from anywhere they might be. There's been a large growth in remote access as people are doing more telecommuting, more working from home, people on the road, traveling. Most organizations provide some sort of remote access, either through virtual desktops, VPNs, SSH access. But because of that growth in remote access needs, there's been a corresponding growth, if you will, in security incidents related to remote access. The Verizon data breach report several years ago noted that there was a 88% or a very high number of attacks or data breaches that actually used remote access to enable those attacks. So it's a very big attack space for the attackers out there to do, and companies and organizations to have to deal with. Just a quick review on VPNs, virtual private networks. These are designed to establish secure communication paths between remote laptops or remote users and their home network or their office network, as it were. Creates an encrypted tunnel to pass data securely between the end user and the network itself. That by encapsulating it or protecting this traffic, it keeps it safe from eavesdropping or interception or tampering. The downside to VPNs is that a lot of them right out of the box don't provide real strong authentication methods, so it's sometimes just a username and password. But there are add-ons that you can add to the VPN implementation to add multi-factor authentication, Radius for authentication as well. You can use tokens, smart cards, whatever have you. There are multiple authentication methods that you can use with VPNs, and it's highly recommended because the way they come out of the box is usually just a username and password. And of course, that can be brute forced by an attacker. There are a couple common VPN technologies out there. You have IPsec implementations of VPNs. You have SSL or TLS-based VPNs like OpenVPN. There are both hardware and software implementations of this. Most of the end user clients, like a home user, will use a software client to connect into a server. But there are implementations where you have software on the laptop that's connecting back to a hardware-based VPN device, like a VPN concentrator. And as a result of this, again, all the traditional security concerns you have with TCP/IP networks all applies here for VPN technology as well. And so you have to do things like logging and auditing. You've got to make sure that people aren't trying to brute force usernames and passwords. You have to use antivirus and anti-malware on the end user devices. And probably the biggest thing here is training policy and guidelines, making sure that you're using the industry standard best practices for VPN implementation to make sure you've got a secure way to operate it. Secure Shell, this has become highly ubiquitous with system administration. It's an alternative and replacement for the non-secure protocols like FTP or Telnet. Because SSH, it's called Secure Shell for a reason. It gives you that remote access, but in a secure manner. And so you don't have to worry about your credentials being compromised by somebody just sniffing traffic on the network. This can also be extended with additional authentication mechanisms like tokens or certificates or public keys. And again, if you're concerned about somebody brute forcing usernames and passwords, look into some type of multi-factor authentication scheme. Most of the SSH server implementations out there will support it. If you look at the SSH handshake between a client and a server, the client, let's say this is a system administrator, is going to request a connection with a server. The next 3 steps in the process all handle the session connection, the setting up the encryption layer, and making sure that the key exchange goes correctly. Once all of that's done, you have that secure connection between the client and the server, and you can have a secure communication with the server and access the resources on it and not have to worry about somebody intercepting what you've done or seeing what you've done because they're sniffing traffic on the network. There are some pitfalls with SSH, and while we do say there are pitfalls with SSH, this is so much better than what you had with Telnet or FTP that really there are ways to get around to solve these pitfalls, and it really, SSH becomes a really good secure implementation. Some of the concerns are weak passwords. When somebody has a password of password, what can you do about that? Well, you should smack the user upside the head and tell them to put a strong password in, or use multi-factor authentication, then you don't have to worry about it. Failing to stay up to date with the most current version. It's been a while since there was any significant vulnerability with OpenSSH server. If you're using a proprietary or perhaps non-open or OpenSSH-based SSH server client, you might want to make sure that you stay up to date on all the patches that are out there. And one of the other things is that it's frequent that companies don't audit SSH access because it's typically used for administrators to come in and remotely do their job. So a lot of organizations think, well, it's just the administrators using it. I don't have to worry about it from a security perspective. When in reality, you do, because one of the concerns is brute force attempts against usernames and passwords. You can see all of that in the OpenSSH logs that are generated when people try to connect and they have failed logins. You can see all of that. And it's very easy to pick out, oh, there's a brute force attack going on right now. So in order to address the password idea or the password problem, a lot of administrators will use keys. And these are just key files on your computer. And so you can use SSH keys to log into the server. That key may have a password on it or it may not. The downside to using keys is that a lot of administrators like to use the same key on multiple systems. So if that key gets compromised, it's not just that one server that you have to worry about, it's where else did the guy use the key. That's where the attacker can spread to. A Ponemon study in 2014 found that there were some issues with SSH. 3 out of the 4 enterprises are vulnerable to root level attacks because of failing to secure SSH keys. 53% said they had no centralized control over keys. It was just, if you need a key, go create one and we'll add it to the system. So there's no central management of that. And then 60% said they have no way to detect new keys. So if I'm a system administrator and I allow you to create your key and import it into the system, there's no visibility into that process. So I would, as the Chief Information Security Officer of the organization, I would have no idea that is going on. Not only is that a configuration management problem that can lead to security issues with people having weak keys, weak passwords, or even compromised keys. I'd have no idea where those keys actually worked, and so I wouldn't know where to actually shut off access. Some of the best practices for implementing SSH, make sure you keep everything patched and up to date. Probably the biggest thing you can do and the biggest bang for your buck is just change the default port SSH runs on. So rather than use port 22 for SSH, pick something arbitrary, 10,002 or something like that. Pick some arbitrary port that when all the script kiddies out there or all the attackers are looking for SSH servers, they're not going to find yours because it's running on some arbitrary port. There was a study done many years ago about the number of attacks against SSH servers, and they found that if you just change the port, change from 22 to anything else, the number of attacks that you'll see against that SSH server drop by 90%. It's an incredible recognition that most of the SSH attacks out there are automated. They're just scripts looking for servers, and then when they do find one, they start trying things against it. But if you realize that's happening, then you change the port, now you're missing all of those automated attacks. It really goes to increase the security of your server implementation. Enforce limits on the number of login attempts, the number of failed logins. If sessions have been idle for more than 20 minutes, log them out. Configure all the SSH clients for keys. That way, rather than using a username and password, you have a username, a password, and a key file. So you've got pseudo multi-factor authentication going on there. Only allowed authorized users. So you want to make an explicit allow for specific users, not allow anybody who's got a user account. And then monitor and audit and keep track of who's logging in, where they're logging in from, what accounts are being created, what keys are being created on the system, and once they're in, what are they doing, what are users doing once they're actually logged into the system. Just traditional security monitoring and operations. Virtual or remote desktop, SSH access is great, but it provides command line access. There are ways of getting graphical interfaces through SSH, but it's certainly not what I'd consider end user easy to do. So along comes virtual desktops, and this is the idea that I can sit down at any computer, log into my virtual desktop system, and see the same computer screen, the same desktop, the same files, the same file servers, the same printers, as if I were just sitting at my desk in the office. So it provides secure access to everything you would normally have in the office. And it's a challenge to protect this because the attackers realize that everybody's using these remote access programs, and so now they're actually going after all of these as well. This is that balance between security and convenience I mentioned at the beginning of this module. The idea that you have employees, they have to be able to work from anywhere in the world. So you have to do remote access. You have to allow this type of stuff just to enable business to happen. Well, the challenge then is to make sure that you do it in a secure manner such that your implementation is not being attacked and being compromised. Because what we find a lot on the attacker side of the house is attackers will go after remote access and remote desktop because it does give them access to everything. And there's been a slew of attacks against Microsoft Terminal services, against remote desktops like VNC, where attackers will try to compromise that. Once they have access to it, they typically have unfettered access to the network. And this is only hampered by the fact that a lot of organizations don't do effective monitoring on their remote access. They assume that, okay, if somebody's got a username and password to access my VPN or my terminal services server, then they must be valid, and I just implicitly trust that that communication's happening. And what we find is that attackers like to do that as well because once they're in, nobody's looking at them. So what do you do about it? How do you secure the remote desktop? Well, understand what ports your systems are using for remote access, looking for those types of connections. If you can change the default ports, do it. Microsoft Terminal Services listens on 3389 for remote desktop. If you don't need it, shut it off. Don't allow an attacker to try to access remote access services if you're not even using them yourself. Know your configurations and implement the strict security controls around that so you don't have attackers trying to brute force usernames and passwords. And use strong authentication so that you have network level authentication. I have a server that has a known identity. All of my remote access users, their laptops have a known identity. Validate that that actually is, each device is on the other side of the communication path and it's not some attacker's laptop, let's say, that's trying to communicate with the server.